When it comes to working with log, raw, and HLG footage in Final Cut Pro, there's a lot of misguided and contradicting advice on the internet about the correct settings. To help you to get the absolute most out of your footage, I wanted to provide a definitive resource with this video. So all of my research has been peer-reviewed by Mark Buck, a Los Angeles-based colorist who knows the ins and outs of Final Cut Pro. Shout out to Mark for taking the time to think that through with me. So you can get the absolute most out of your footage, first we will have a look at what the correct settings actually are. Then, instead of being just another guy who shouts some settings at you, we will assess the why behind all of these settings, so you can leave the uncertainty behind you once and for all and focus on what actually matters. Last disclaimer before I get going, this video focuses on SDR delivery only, so I assume your goal is to deliver in Rec. 709, even though your source material might be log, raw, or HLG footage. Okay, what are the correct settings? This is basically everything you need to know. In particular, you want to pay attention to these settings. First, the library setting. If you want to deliver an SDR, choose SDR and not wide gamut HDR. It doesn't matter whether you're working with log, raw, or HLG footage. SDR is the correct setting. Next, let's have a look at the settings for your material. If you're working with HLG footage, I recommend that you use a proper color space transformation LUT. If you decide to go that route, you need to set the color space override to Rec. 709. If you use log footage that uses the Rec. 2020 gamut, you need to set the color space override to Rec. 709. Next, if you're working with log footage that uses any other gamut like S gamut, V gamut, Canon Cinema gamut, and so on, the clip metadata will likely show Rec. 709, or it won't show anything at all. In either of these cases, don't touch the color space override. It will work out. Lastly, the LUT input and output settings. Leave them as is. Usually it defaults to input Rec. 709 and output Rec. 709. Pause the video if you want to read the table or take a screenshot. As mentioned before, I don't think you should take my word as gospel, as this will not improve your understanding. So instead, let's have a look at these settings one by one and test and verify everything along the way so you know exactly what you're doing. First, let's have a look at the library setting. If you go to the browser and select your library, you will see that in the inspector, your library shows up. Here is the name of your library. To the right-hand side, you will find this modify button. If you click this, you will see this pop up. We're prompted with an information about this setting that reads, "This setting changes the working color space and processing for effects, including built-in camera LUT conversions for log media, and may affect the appearance of all projects and media in the library." Now we can choose between standard gamut SDR and wide gamut HDR. Let's take that bite-sized. One of the settings we can choose is wide gamut HDR, which is a combination of two things, a wide gamut and a high dynamic brightness range. First, let's have a look at the term wide gamut. Let's say I'm shooting with a Sony in S-Log3 S-Gamut3.Cine. S-Log3 indicates how brightness is encoded, so we can leave that aside for now. S-Gamut3.Cine says that we're using one of Sony's cinema gamuts. Now, what does that mean? You have probably seen this before. This is a chromaticity diagram. The body of the chromaticity diagram shows approximately all colors humans can see. Inside, you will usually find these triangles that indicates the colors that can be captured or displayed in a given gamut. The corners of these triangles are your primaries: red, green, and blue. The shape of this triangle defines what these primaries actually mean. This is the Rec. 709 gamut, and this is S-Gamut3.Cine. As you can see, S-Gamut3.Cine is much wider than Rec. 709. Therefore, people assume that they need to choose wide gamut HDR as their library setting to take advantage of the larger color space. However, this is not correct, and I will show you why in just a minute. Let's quickly discuss the HDR in wide gamut HDR. This refers to how brightness is handled. In that specific case, it just means how bright can it get. This is an oversimplification, of course, but the only thing you need to know now is that SDR content usually happens between 0 and 100 RE, whereas HDR goes way brighter depending on the HDR specification. In summary, the setting wide gamut HDR allows for more saturated colors and brighter ones. I gave you some hints before, but common misbeliefs about the settings are these. Number 1. If you're working with log, HLG, or raw footage, you need to set this to wide gamut HDR to take advantage of the larger gamut. Number 2. Log, HLG, or raw footage has a huge amount of dynamic range. Therefore, people assume they need to choose this setting. And number 3, the library settings determine how your tools work. That means how your color wheels and curves operate. If you don't change the setting, your tools will not work correctly on HLG, log, or raw footage. In order to debunk these three misconceptions, we have to understand how Final Cut Pro operates and focus on the term working color space. Remember the pop-up? After all, this setting seems to change the working color space. And I think this is the main reason why people get confused. The common concern is, if the working color space in Final Cut Pro is set to Rec 709, it will impose limitations on dynamic range and color information. Because as discussed, Rec 709 allows for significantly less dynamic range than the HLG, log or raw footage can provide. Also, the larger color space doesn't fit into Rec 709. Therefore, we're leaving something on the table, right? Well, not really. Final Cut Pro performs all operations on your footage using floating point calculations. Don't be scared, you don't have to know what that means. You just have to know that no matter whether your operation is within or without the bounds of Rec 709, it gets calculated properly. And again, therefore, I think the confusion comes from the actual term working color space. Usually, this indicates how operations are calculated. However, in the Final Cut Pro universe, working color space rather refers to the question, what is your end goal, if that makes any sense. What we need to take from this is that the library setting doesn't impose any limitations on how Final Cut Pro operates on your footage. No matter whether it's within or without Rec 709, Final Cut Pro calculates it properly. Because again, working color space in Final Cut Pro doesn't define the color space where operations are calculated. It only defines the end result you want to export at the end. Let's see what that means. For example, as the title indicates, this setting is set to standard gamut SDR. And if I select my project here, you can see the color space is Rec 709. I go to my clip, bring up my scopes, and I might even get rid of the browser for now. So I make the view a little bit bigger so we can see what's going on. Okay, I apply an instance of color wheels, go in here, and push all of my footage way down. You can see everything is gone. If our working color space was constrained by the limits of Rec 709, this would mean we cannot bring that back, right? However, I leave that instance of color wheels as is. If I apply another instance of color wheels afterwards, I go in here and perform the opposite operation. And as you can see, everything comes back just fine. I go to the inspector and delete both corrections. Another proof for this is right inside the viewer menu. If you click this drop down, you can see Range Check Rec 709. It can show you all the colors and the luma that goes outside of Rec 709. I select all for now. If I apply an instance of color wheels and push the footage way up, you can see these dotted lines start to appear. This indicates there is some information that is outside of Rec 709. But again, if I apply another instance of color wheels, I can still work on that information. Nothing is lost. So if our working color space was really limited by Rec 709, it would just be cut off. But I can still operate there and Final Cut Pro calculates everything properly. It just will be cut off once I export this, because remember, my goal is to export in Rec 709. Now, with that knowledge in mind, we can easily debunk the three misconceptions I mentioned earlier. Starting with number one. If you're working with log, HLG or raw footage, you need to set this to wide gamut HDR to take advantage of the larger gamut. As just discussed, we now know that Final Cut Pro performs all calculations properly, no matter whether it's within or without of the bounds of the seeming working color space. But let's actually prove this. I go into the inspector and delete all corrections. Now I bring up the browser. Let's have a look. This library contains all of the same media and is set to wide gamut HDR. You can see if I click the modify button, wide gamut HDR is selected. But this will also show up on the right-hand side of the name of your library. Now, I select the wide gamut HDR project and have a look at its settings. You can see I have chosen Rec 709 as my color space. And if I leave my mouse on here, you can see this pop-up, which reads, set the render and output color space. Global color processing from the current library is set to wide gamut HDR. So remember what I said at the beginning of this video. My final goal is to export Rec 709. Therefore, I choose Rec 709 here. I click OK. Once again, this library, on the other hand, is set to standard gamut SDR. If the misconception was true and there is actually more information to see, then we should be able to see it if the library is set to wide gamut HDR, right? Therefore, let's open up our scopes and get some objective readings. I will close the browser so we can see what's going on, and I will jump between my timelines. So this is the project in the wide gamut library, and this is the project in the SDR library. Starting with this piece of footage. This is slog3 sgamma3.cine, so definitely bigger than Rec 709, right? Okay, let's have a look. I make my vector scope a little bit bigger so we can see what the colors do a little bit better. But okay, this is the SDR library, and this is the wide gamut HDR library. Again, SDR library and wide gamut HDR library. Did you spot the difference? Me neither. They are identical. But there's actually another thing you need to understand about log footage. In its original log-encoded stage, so what we are seeing on screen right now, all of the information the footage contains is very compressed. Therefore, it appears washed out and low in saturation. Recording using a larger gamut allows for more color information to be captured. Yes, but log footage in its initial state is so compressed that it doesn't even occupy the full range of Rec 709. I know this is hard to wrap your head around, but think about it this way. This piece of footage holds an immense amount of information. So this is all of the information this footage holds. But in its original state, all of the information is compressed. So this fits well within Rec 709. And if we start working with our footage, Final Cut Pro will, of course, utilize all of the information our footage has in code. In fact, log footage holds so much information that we can use it for SDR projects or even HDR projects. And again, Final Cut Pro will of course work with all of the information your footage provides. Because if we conform our log footage, let's fold it up again, if we conform our log footage to Rec 709, we are not using the full potential of our footage. As you can see, it is still a little bit compressed. But most importantly, nothing is lost, right? Okay, the main takeaway here is that Final Cut Pro performs all operations correctly and operates on every bit of information your footage provides, regardless of the library setting. With log footage, there wouldn't be an issue at all because even though it holds more information in code, in its initial state, it doesn't even remotely occupy the Rec 709 color space. Hold that thought, we need to come back to this later. Lastly, working color space in Final Cut Pro only decides what ends up in my final export and does not impose any limitations on Final Cut Pro calculations. Next, let's have a look at the second misconception. Log, HLG or RAW footage has a huge amount of dynamic range. Therefore, people assume you need to choose the setting. This is a little bit more tricky. First, let's compare the footage visually in the SDR and the HDR library. So inside of the SDR library, I choose this clip and you can see this is HLG BT 2020. If I go into the inspector here, you can also see it here. Rec 2020 HLG. Now take a second to look at the scopes. Next, we go into the HDR library. Then I select this clip as well. So I go back once again. This is the SDR library and this is the HDR library. Still, despite this piece of footage being HLG, it is identical in the SDR and HDR library. However, if we have a look at the inspector, you can see that Final Cut Pro applies the automatic color conform. It does this in the HDR library as well as in the SDR library. Let's go back to the HDR library. If Final Cut Pro doesn't apply the color conform automatically, you might want to go to Settings, General, and on the HDR, make sure Automatic Color Conform is checked. This lets Final Cut Pro treat HDR footage correctly automatically. Now I close this and I disable Color Conform. So this is what the footage actually looks like. Because HLG is capable of HDR after all. Unsurprisingly, this goes way beyond the range of Rec 709. So remember, we are in the wide gamut HDR library. Here, I can just take an instance of color wheels, go in here, and pull down the highlights. As you can see, everything goes back and these dotted lines disappear. There's no issue at all. But what happens in the SDR library? I go back here, select this clip, and I need to disable the automatic color conform, apply an instance of color wheels, go in here, and try to pull it down. And as you can see, despite being in the SDR library, everything works out wonderfully. I think this should be proof enough. No matter your library setting, Final Cut Pro will operate properly on every bit of information your footage provides. Therefore, we officially debunked the first two misconceptions. But there is still one to go. And additionally, now the question becomes, if it doesn't even matter for Rec 709 delivery, which setting should you choose? To answer this, we need to take a look at the third misconception, which actually is only partially wrong. The library setting determines how your tools work. That means how your color wheels and curves operate. If you don't choose this setting, your tools will not work correctly on HLG, log, or RAW footage. We are still in the SDR library, and we will go back to the shot in slog3 sgamma3.cine. First, I will apply the proper LUT. So I will search for LUT, apply the LUT loader, like so, and choose the proper LUT. I go into Camter X, Sony, slog3 sgamma3.cine to Rec 709. Here we go. I exposed this clip according to Sony's recommendations for slog3. If I search for my check layer, like so, I can enable the mask and select this 18% gray chip. As you can see, 18% gray should correspond to 46 to 50 IRE in the scopes, and surely, after applying the proper LUT, it does. Now, I get rid of my check layer and apply an instance of color curves. I go in here and select the eyedropper. Now I sample a bit of this chip. You can see a point appears rather close to 50%. So if 0 is here, 50 is here, and 100 is here, yeah, we're rather close, between 46 and 50 IRE. So this is what you would expect. However, let's go to the HDR library. I select the slog3 clip, and again I will apply the proper LUT. So I will choose the LUT loader, go in here, slog3 sgamma3.cine to Rec 709, and here we go. Now I also apply an instance of color curves, and choose the eyedropper, and sample this point as well. Look at that! Final Cut Pro created a point at a significantly lower value. But if I go out here and apply my check layer again, like so, we can toggle the mask and select this 18% gray chip, you can see the brightness didn't change. So what's going on? I get rid of my check layer and go back into the color curves. Just for comparison's sake, this is the wide gamut HDR library and this is the SDR library. Note that the point Final Cut Pro created is way higher here. This means, yes, the tools are indeed optimized for grading HDR content. And therefore, yes, changing the library setting will change how your tools behave. But if your goal is to deliver in Rec 709, there is no need for HDR tools, because they do not behave as you would expect when grading for SDR delivery. Adding insult to injury, the reading of the eyedropper in the wide gamut HDR library was just plain wrong. Furthermore, as I demonstrated before, the tools in the HDR library can pull back the highlights from the HDR clip, but the tools in the SDR library did that too. So again, there is nothing to be gained here working in an HDR library. In conclusion, if your priority is delivering your project as Rec 709, do not choose the wide gamut HDR as your library setting, regardless of the material you use. As we discovered, there is nothing to be gained here. Even when we are working with HDR source material, Final Cut Pro will work with your footage properly because the term working color space in Final Cut Pro only refers to your intended delivery. Therefore, if you want to deliver in Rec 709, use an SDR library. Okay, that's that. Next, let's have a look at the color space override. Many of the resources you will find online don't really understand or communicate what this setting actually does, which leads to a lot of misguided advice. To find this setting, select a clip, go to the inspector, and inside of the information tab. By default, this will be set to default, so click here and select Settings. This is where you can also find your camera LUT, which you should never use by the way, but I discussed that in another video. If you want to find out more about that, there's a link in the video description. Just above, you can see that there is the color space override. First, let's reference the Final Cut Pro manual to understand what the color space override actually is. Apple writes, you can use the color space override setting to correct the color space metadata, so Final Cut Pro processes and displays the selected clip properly. Metadata is data about data. In our case, it's information about our clip. If we change the color space override, we are not altering the clip in any way. We just alter the information about our clip. Think about it as a name tag. Imagine I'm your clip and I wear a name tag that says Rec 2020 HLG. With that name tag, Final Cut Pro processes me. If we change the color space override, we only change the name tag. I don't change, only my name tag changes, like this. However, this will result in Final Cut Pro processing me differently. Let's go to the HLG clip. If I select it, you can see at the top of the inspector it says, indeed, Rec 2020 HLG. Since we're working in a Rec 709 timeline, Final Cut Pro has done the proper tone mapping to conform this footage. If I come back to the inspector, you can see color conform is enabled by default, HDR, HLG to SDR. Final Cut Pro does this because it processes the HLG clip as an HDR clip, which you can see if I turn off the color conform. This is the clip in its HDR interpretation, and this is the clip conformed to Rec. 709. If I come back to the Information tab and change the color space override to Rec. 709, you can see our footage changes visually. At the same time, if we come back to the inspector, you can see that color conform is now automatically turned off. This happens because Final Cut Pro doesn't process our footage as HDR in the first place. It treats it as Rec. 709. Before we can move on though, let's briefly discuss why we can do this with HLG footage. HLG is short for Hybrid Log Gamma. This is a high dynamic range format designed for HDR delivery. However, since it's a hybrid, it is backwards compatible with standard dynamic range and ultimately Rec. 709. This is the reason why we just can change the color space override and therefore treat it as Rec. 709 and everything works out. The only real misconception here is that the color space override somehow clamps your footage to Rec. 709. But we can already discard this misconception because we just discussed that changing the color space override doesn't affect the clip itself. It only changes the name tag. However, I see where this misconception comes from, because if we change the color space override to Rec. 709, it will look differently and the highlights become a little bit squished. So let's discuss why not, and when you should use the color space override. I go back in the Information tab and turn the color space override off. HLG shows up as Rec. 2020 HLG. However, we just learned that HLG is a hybrid format which can be processed as HDR as well as Rec. 709 without any loss. The only caveat is that our highlights get a bit squished. If we want to deliver in Rec. 709 anyway, there is no reason to process this clip as HDR first and then bring it down to SDR, because none of this changes anything about the footage. Therefore, I recommend setting the color space override to Rec. 709. Now again, when I set the color space override to Rec. 709, you can see that the tag at the top of the inspector changes, but also you can see that our footage looks now a little bit flat and a little bit green. Also, we need to address our squished highlights. Now, here's the thing. Hybrid Log Gamma has log in its name. Therefore, when we use the color space override, we need to treat it like log footage, which means we need to apply the proper color space transformation LUT. So if I come out here and apply the custom LUT effect, like so, I will go in here and select the proper HLG LUT. So Sony, HLG to Rec. 709. And as you can see, we get a valid result. Our footage looks correct now, and our highlights are no longer squished. I recommend using the color space override in combination with a proper color space transformation LUT, as this gives you the most predictable result when working with HLG footage. Next, let's address log footage. As discussed earlier, log footage in its initial state fits well within Rec. 709. Remember, the information is just compressed. I come back to my S-Log3 clip and select it and go into the Information tab. If you're shooting log on your camera, chances are the metadata will say Rec. 709. This is completely fine because, again, our footage holds way more information in code, but in its initial state, it can be displayed and treated as Rec. 709 without any loss. Therefore, if the metadata says Rec. 709, don't do anything. Also, if it says nothing, don't do anything either. Some cameras, including the more recent iPhone models, utilize the Rec. 2020 gamut when shooting log. This will also appear as Rec. 2020 in your inspector. For example, this shot. This is Apple log. If I go into the inspector, you can see it appears as Rec. 2020. But in its initial state, it can be displayed and treated as Rec. 709 without any loss. Therefore, you need to set the color space override to Rec. 709. Last but not least, while we're here, let's talk about the LUT input and output setting. If you reference the Final Cut Pro user manual, it says that you should choose the setting according to the specifications of your LUT. So if your LUT says it goes from Rec. 2020 to Rec. 709, you should use Rec. 2020 as an input. However, this approach is not applicable in our use case. Look, Apple is right that the LUT needs the correct input. For example, let's have a look at this HLG clip again. If I come back to the Information tab and disable the color space override, you can see this clearly isn't a valid result. I applied the proper HLG LUT, but this is not correct. Partly, this is because if I turn off the color space override, Final Cut Pro will trigger the automatic color conform. If I disable this, you can see this is not a valid result either. What I would need to do now is set the input for the LUT to Rec 2020 HLG. Now we get a valid result. But look what I just did. I manually disabled the color conform and I needed to change the LUT input setting. So this took me 2 clicks and I know exactly what I'm doing. If I would be unsure about what I'm doing, this becomes 2 potential sources for errors. Therefore, if you follow my recommendations and use the color space override, you don't need to change the LUT input settings ever. That being said, I reset everything. When I set the color space override to Rec 709, I already tell Final Cut Pro to treat this HLG clip as Rec 709. Therefore, the LUT will receive the correct input. If we have a look at the name of the LUT though, it says it goes from Rec 2020 or BT 2020 to Rec 709. So what's that all about then? I can see this can be a bit confusing, but remember what we discussed. Log footage and HLG footage in its initial state can be represented in Rec 709 without any loss. Remember, the information is just compressed and fits well within Rec 709. Even if the LUT input is set to Rec 709, the LUT will do what it says because it will still operate on every bit of information our footage holds. The job of the LUT is to decompress your footage in a mathematically correct way. And this is exactly what it does. Look, the footage is flat and green because this is the Rec 709 interpretation of Rec 2020 HLG or any kind of log. If I apply a LUT, everything works out. This is HLG before, flat and green, and this is HLG with the proper LUT. Or here, this is S-Log3, flat and green, and if I apply the custom LUT effect and choose the proper LUT, Sony, S-Log3, S-Gamma3.Cine to Rec 709, everything works out. So again, the LUT takes care of everything. And the same is true for any other log footage, no matter whether it's V-Gamut, S-Gamut, Canon Cinema Gamut, or whatever. Since Final Cut Pro operates on every bit of information your footage provides, the LUT can go from S-Log3, S-Gamma3.Cine to Rec 709 and it will do what it says. If you follow my recommendations, you don't have to change the LUT settings ever. One thing you should know about the LUT settings is that if the input equals the output, Final Cut Pro won't do anything. By default, this will be set to input Rec 709 and output Rec 709. This is your indication that the LUT does its job as intended, because Final Cut Pro doesn't do anything. To reiterate, for HLG, this works because we set the color space override to Rec 709. And for any other log footage, no matter which gamut, whether it's S-Gamut, Rec 2020 or whatever, it doesn't matter, because log footage in its initial state can be displayed within Rec 709, and all of the information will be there. It's just compressed. If we circle back to the beginning of this video where we found out that Final Cut Pro operates on every bit of information your footage can offer, regardless of the library setting, you can now feel at ease with the LUT setting set to Rec 709 in and Rec 709 out. Meaning, no matter what, you will always use the full potential of your footage. Once again, here are my recommendations for Rec 709 delivery. In this video, I used the Chem2Rec LUTs, which is a suite of color space transformation LUTs I developed. They are completely free and the link is in the video description. As you can see, it covers most of the cameras out there, with more to come very soon. A correct color space transformation LUT is absolutely crucial. But if you still believe in the avoid LUTs at all cost mantra, you might want to watch this video next so you can stop wasting your time.